All birds will flock to a fruitful tree. Europeans arrive in Africa 1364. In context. Location: Sub-Saharan Africa. Circa 11 CE, the Moors' conquest of Iberia begins, forging links between Europe and Africa. 1312, Genoese merchant Lanzarote Manocello built a base in what is now called Lanzarote. After 1510 to 1866, some 12.5 million Africans are forced aboard European and American slave ships bound for the New World. 1550, the travels in West Africa of Spanish Berber Leo Africanus prompt Europeans to redraw their map of Africa. 1796, Scotsman Mungo Park attempts to trace the course of the Niger River on behalf of Britain's African Association. 1884 to 1900, in the, quote, scramble for Africa, unquote, European powers B to colonize 90% of African territory. The arrival of mariners on Africa's west coast in the 15th century and is possibly as early as the 14th century is typically regarded as a landmark meeting between Africans and Europeans. Yet, Europeans and Africans had already encountered each other in relatively equal terms long before. Since the time of ancient Egypt 3 millennia earlier, there had been an African presence in the Mediterranean world. After the conquest of Carthage, Tunisia, in 146 BC, the Romans' productive North African colonies became known as the breadbasket of Rome. In the 8th century, the Moors' invasion of Iberia brought North Africans into medieval Europe. In the 12th and 13th centuries, European crusaders brought news of African Christians in Ethiopia, and during the 14th century, diplomats and delegations from Ethiopia traveled to Europe. In the medieval period, regional and international trading networks in sub-Saharan Africa stretched from the coast of West Africa to North Africa and from East Coast city-states across the Indian Ocean. Yet, Europeans had only minimal knowledge of Africa's vast empires, relying on Muslim intermediaries in any trade between the two regions. From the 10th century onward, merchants traveling in Africa's interior produced rudimentary maps. In the 13th century, Venetians are said to have traveled through Tunis, and Europeans may have penetrated south of the Sahara in search of gold. Berber Moroccan scholar and explorer Ibn Battuta may have piqued interest in Africa's potential bounty with his travels in Asia and Africa. 1353, in which he described the remarkable wealth accrued through trade in gold and salt of Mansa Musa, king of Mali. Norman merchants from Dieppe may have reached the Guinea coast as early as 1364, but the only voyages to West Africa that remain documented were the 15th century Portuguese expedition sponsored by Prince Henry the Navigator. Their mission was to find sea routes to India, trade for gold, and counter Muslim domination in Africa. Their light sailing ships, caravels, reached the Senegal region in 1444 and continued to make merchant voyages down the coast, making contact with Africans in West Central, and Southern Africa. In early encounters, communities were hospitable but presciently wary of the Europeans' intentions. The first shipment back to Portugal in 1444 was of gold dust and captive Africans. After mariners reached the coast of modern-day Ghana in 1471, gold trade with the Akan people flourished to the point that the Portuguese renamed the coast Mina, the mine later known as the Gold Coast. Within decades, the Portuguese had built a string of forts and established a monopoly on trade with West Africa that lasted throughout the 16th century. After Vasco da Gama rounded Africa's Cape of Good Hope in 1498, the Portuguese also tried to dominate the gold trade on the East Coast with limited success. Trade in people. By the time the Dutch established their first trading post in West Africa in 1598, traffic in enslaved people from Africa was the main European objective. By the 1620s, more than 100,000 Africans had been shipped to Madeira, Cape Verde, and Gulf of Guinea Islands, and about 400,000 to the Americas. War between France, Britain, and the Netherlands from 1652 to 1713 was played out on Africa's western coast in a race to establish colonies and slave trading posts. The Europeans' arrival in Africa had forged links across the Atlantic connecting Africa, Europe, and the Americas, but at a calamitous expense of Africa's independent path of development.